Karen was the kind of person who thrived on control. In our suburban neighborhood, she had somehow declared herself the unofficial enforcer of the homeowners association, despite never actually being elected to any official position. No one had asked her to take on this role, but that didn't matter to Karen. She saw herself as the only one capable of maintaining order. She would send out passive-aggressive notes about minor infractions, from slightly overgrown lawns to trash bins left out an hour past pickup. If someone's car was parked just a little too far from the curb, she'd be the first to point it out. It didn't matter if the rule she was enforcing was outdated or completely arbitrary. If you even slightly stepped out of line in her eyes, you would hear about it. Most of the neighborhood had learned to tolerate her antics. Some fought back, but most just ignored her, knowing that resistance only fueled her self-righteousness. The actual HOA board was made up of reluctant volunteers, people who didn't enjoy enforcing rules and mostly wanted to keep things running smoothly. They had long since decided that dealing with Karen's constant complaints wasn't worth the headache, so they let her act as an unofficial authority figure just to avoid the confrontation. She wasn't technically in charge, but she acted like she was, and unfortunately, she got away with it. What made her particularly insufferable wasn't just the way she lorded over the neighborhood but the fact that she never held herself to the same standards she imposed on everyone else. While she harassed people about their lawns, her own yard was an eyesore, riddled with weeds and dying grass. Her trash bin sat out for days past collection, yet she had once sent a warning letter to a neighbor for doing the same thing. And despite being obsessed with parking violations, she regularly left her oversized SUV in places that blocked mailboxes, fire hydrants, and even driveways. No one dared to call her out on it, though, because everyone knew what happened when you got on Karen's bad side. She had a way of making your life miserable, and she seemed to enjoy doing it. I had my fair share of run-ins with her over the years. The first time was when she left a pink warning slip on my door, claiming my porch light was too bright and violated some non-existent regulation. Another time, she banged on my door at 7 in the morning on a Saturday to complain that my recycling bin was improperly sorted, as if she was personally in charge of waste management. But my personal favorite was when she fined me $50 for excessive weeds in my front yard, just one day after I had paid a professional landscaping company to redo my lawn. I wasn't the only one she targeted. A neighbor down the street, Mr. Carter, had once been fined $100 for a parking violation. His car's back tire was a single inch over the curb. The irony? Karen's own SUV was always parked far worse, but she never fined herself. She had even tried to fine an elderly neighbor, Mr. Howard, for having a wind chime on his porch, claiming it was a nuisance noise. The level of pettiness was almost impressive. Despite everything, most people in the neighborhood just tried to keep their heads down and avoid her wrath. But Karen had a way of pushing things too far, and eventually, she was bound to cross the wrong person at the wrong time. She had no idea her reign of terror was about to come crashing down. That morning, I stepped onto my porch with a cup of coffee, expecting a normal start to my day. The air was crisp, the street was quiet, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to enjoy the peacefulness. But then I saw it, Karen's massive SUV, parked directly in front of my driveway, blocking me in completely. I blinked, hoping I was seeing things. Maybe it was just a delivery driver who had stopped for a moment. Maybe a neighbor had made a mistake. But no, there was no mistaking it. That oversized gas-guzzling tank belonged to Karen, and she had left it sitting right across my driveway, making it impossible for me to leave. At first, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she didn't realize. Maybe she had an emergency and had to leave her car there temporarily. I pulled out my phone and sent a quick, polite text. "Hey Karen, your SUV is blocking my driveway. Can you move it?" Minutes passed. No response. I waited, sipping my coffee, hoping to hear the sound of a car starting up. Nothing. I called her phone, and it rang once before going straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. Annoyance bubbled into frustration as I checked the time. I had a meeting in less than an hour, and I couldn't afford to sit around waiting for Karen to decide when it was convenient for her to follow the most basic rule of street parking. I walked over to her house and knocked firmly on the door. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. After a long silence, I heard movement from inside, then her voice, sharp and irritated. What do you want? Karen, your SUV is blocking my driveway. I need to leave. There was a long pause before she responded, her tone dripping with condescension. Oh, I'll move it later. I'm busy. Busy? Busy doing what? Sitting inside ignoring my calls? I clenched my jaw, trying to stay calm. Karen, I have somewhere to be. You can't just leave your car like that. Well, she said, her voice light and mocking, maybe you should plan ahead better. You can't expect me to drop everything just to move my car. Plan ahead? How was I supposed to plan for someone illegally blocking my driveway? My patience was gone. Karen, move your car now. She let out a long, dramatic sigh. I'll get to it when I can. That was it. I wasn't going to argue with her anymore. She had made her choice. If she wanted to play games, I would play too, but I'd play by the rules she loved so much. I pulled out my phone and dialed the local towing company. Yeah, hi. I need a vehicle removed from my driveway. It's completely blocking my exit, and the owner refuses to move it. The moment I hung up, a wave of satisfaction rolled over me. If Karen thought she was above the rules, she was about to get a very expensive reminder that she wasn't. 15 minutes later, the low rumble of a tow truck echoed down the street. It was a beautiful sound. The truck pulled up, and the driver, a no-nonsense guy with a clipboard, stepped out, taking one look at the situation and shaking his head. Yeah, that's a clear violation, he muttered. She's lucky it's not the city towing her. I nodded, arms crossed as I watched him begin the process of hooking up Karen's SUV. It was almost poetic. Her precious vehicle, the same one she had parked wherever she pleased for years, was now about to be hauled away. The moment the chains clanked against the metal, Karen's front door swung open. She stormed out, phone in hand, looking completely unbothered, until she saw the tow truck. Wait! Wait! What are you doing? She shrieked, running toward the truck, her voice sharp enough to make a few neighbors peek out their windows. I folded my arms, standing firm. Since you refuse to move your car, I had it towed. You can't do this. Her face turned an impressive shade of red as she waved her phone wildly in the air. I'm on the HOA board. I let out a slow, satisfied breath. Actually, I can, I said, gesturing toward the tow truck driver, who had just finished securing her vehicle. She sputtered, her eyes darting around the street as if searching for backup, but there was none. Just a few amused neighbors watching the scene unfold. The driver climbed back into his truck, and with a loud whir of the engine, Karen's SUV was lifted off the pavement. You're going to regret this, she screeched, but I barely heard her. All I could focus on was the sight of her car disappearing down the street. I was pretty sure I wouldn't regret it at all. Karen was back at my door within minutes, pounding so hard I thought she might actually break the frame. I took my time answering, letting her stew just a little longer. When I finally opened it, she was standing there, ace red with fury, phone still clutched in her hand like a weapon. You had no right to tow my car, she screeched, shoving her phone in my face as if I had violated some sacred law of the universe. This is harassment. I'm calling the police. I crossed my arms, unimpressed. Go ahead, Karen. Call them. I'd love to see how they react when you tell them you were illegally blocking someone's driveway and refused to move your car when asked. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, the realization sinking in that she wasn't in a position of power here. For once, she wasn't the one dictating the rules. She was the one being held accountable. "You're going to pay for this," she snapped, shifting tactics. "I'm taking this to the HOA board, and you'll regret messing with me." "Sounds good," I said casually. "I'll bring the photos, timestamps, and my call log to the meeting." "Looking forward to it." Karen's expression twisted with frustration. She had no real power, and she knew it. But still, she wasn't going to go down without a fight. That evening, the HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread fast, and nearly the entire neighborhood had shown up, eager to witness the showdown. Karen stormed in with her usual overinflated confidence, acting like she was the victim of some great injustice. "This man," she announced dramatically, pointing at me, "had my car towed without warning. He violated community rules and needs to be held accountable." I calmly stood up, pulled out my phone, and displayed the photos for everyone to see. Karen's SUV blocked my driveway for hours. I texted her. I called her. I knocked on her door. She refused to move it. What was I supposed to do? Miss work because Karen doesn't feel like following the rules? Mr. Mitchell, the HOA president, cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Karen, is this true?" She faltered, looking around as if expecting support. I was busy." He could have waited. The murmurs in the room told me everything I needed to know. No one was on her side. And then, the Real bomb dropped. A neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, stood up. "Actually, Karen has done this before. She parks wherever she wants and ignores complaints." Another neighbor, Mr. Carter, chimed in. "Yeah, she blocked my driveway once too. I had to call the city to get her ticketed." One by one, people began sharing their grievances. Stories about Karen fining people for the same things she did herself, issuing warnings over trivial nonsense, and making up rules that didn't exist. The more they spoke, the more Karen shrank in her seat. Mr. Mitchell let out a heavy sigh. "Karen, effective immediately, you are no longer allowed to make unilateral decisions about community rules. Furthermore, you are responsible for paying all towing fees yourself." Karen gasped as if she had been personally attacked. "You can't do that. I'm on the board." "Not anymore," Mr. Mitchell said firmly. "The board has voted. You're out." A wave of hushed excitement rippled through the room. Scattered applause broke out, and Karen's face turned a deep shade of crimson. She looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. She tried to argue, but her voice was drowned out by the years of pent-up frustration from the people she had tormented. Her downfall should have ended there. But Karen wasn't one to accept defeat gracefully. The next morning, I found a letter taped to my door, an official-looking notice claiming my lawn was not up to neighborhood standards, and that I had unauthorized decorations on my porch. The kicker? Both violations were completely made up. I wasn't even mad. I almost admired the sheer pettiness of it. Almost. I took the letter straight to Mr. Mitchell. He sighed, rubbing his temples as he read it. "She's really not letting this go, huh?" "Nope," I said. "And unless she started a new career as a city inspector overnight, I don't think she has the authority to issue violations anymore." He muttered something under his breath, then shook his head. "Don't worry. I'll handle it." By handle it, he meant publicly calling Karen out in the HOA group chat, reminding everyone that she was no longer in charge and that all complaints should be filed through the actual board, not through her. It was beautiful. Karen was livid. Her last shred of power had been taken away, and she couldn't stand it. But she wasn't done yet. She resorted to petty revenge, glaring at me from across the street, leaving snarky comments on the neighborhood Facebook page, and even calling the city to report supposed violations at my house. Unfortunately for her, the city inspector found nothing wrong. In fact, He even joked about how often Karen made pointless complaints. But the real blow came a few weeks later, when the HOA did a full audit of their finances. And what they found changed everything. The cracks in Karen's reign had already started to show, but when the HOA conducted a full audit of their finances, those cracks shattered completely. It turned out Karen hadn't just been issuing bogus violations and lording over the neighborhood, she had also been dipping into the HOA funds for her own personal projects. At first, the board had assumed the discrepancies were minor, maybe clerical errors. But as they dug deeper, the truth became impossible to ignore. Karen had been using community funds for personal expenses, including repainting her fence, installing a fancy new security camera system, and even replacing her mailbox with a high-end custom one. The worst part? She had framed these expenses as necessary community improvements in the budget reports, knowing full well that no one had approved them. When the board confronted her, she tried to deny it, acting indignant as if the entire ordeal was beneath her. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed at the emergency HOA meeting, rolling her eyes. "I was improving the neighborhood. I shouldn't have to justify that." Mr. Mitchell, who had clearly had enough of her, pushed a stack of receipts toward her. "Karen, explain why the HOA paid for a professional landscaping service at your house. Or better yet, why there's a charge for a $200 wine delivery that went straight to your front door." Karen's face twitched as the murmurs in the room grew louder. She scrambled for an excuse, flipping through papers she had brought with her, but it was useless. The evidence was overwhelming. "This is a coordinated attack," she snapped, standing abruptly. "You're all just looking for ways to punish me because I tried to bring order to this neighborhood." Mr. Carter let out a bitter laugh. "Order? You fined me for parking half an inch over the curb while you were stealing from the HOA." Karen's jaw clenched. She turned to the few remaining allies she might have had, but no one was willing to defend her. Even those who had once supported her were now looking at her with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. "The board has voted," Mr. Mitchell announced, his voice steady. "You are required to repay every dollar you took, plus an additional fine for misusing HOA funds. Failure to do so will result in legal action." Karen's face drained of color. "You can't do this," she hissed. "We already did," he replied. For the first time, Karen had nothing to say. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. But she wasn't done. In the days following the meeting, Karen became desperate to regain control. With the HOA no longer bending to her will, she escalated to reporting people directly to the city. She filed bogus complaints against her neighbors, citing violations that didn't exist, overgrown lawns, improper trash disposal, and even unauthorized home modifications. It was laughable, but the city took complaints seriously, so they sent an inspector out to investigate. And that's when karma delivered the perfect blow. The inspector went through the neighborhood, checking every single complaint Karen had filed. He found nothing, except violations on Karen's own property. Her brand new, HOA-funded fence. It violated city ordinances because she had never filed for the proper permits. Her expensive security camera system. It was encroaching on public property and had to be removed. The cherry on top. The city fined her for each infraction. Word spread fast. The very same person who had spent years weaponizing rules against her neighbors had now been taken down by those same rules. Karen was furious. She tried to argue with the inspector, but unlike the HOA, the city didn't have patience for her theatrics. She was given a strict deadline to fix the violations or face even heavier fines. With every passing day, Karen's influence crumbled. The final, desperate attempt to regain her status came when she announced that she was running for an actual HOA leadership position. She sent out flyers, knocked on doors, even tried to convince people that the new board was corrupt and that she was the only one who could restore order. She hosted a community meeting at her house, hoping to rally support. Not a single person showed up. On election day, when the votes were counted, Karen received exactly one vote, her own. That was the moment she finally understood that she had lost completely. Her last shred of power was gone. No one feared her anymore. No one cared what she had to say. She had spent years making enemies out of her neighbors, and now, there was no one left on her side. After that, Karen withdrew from the neighborhood. No more notes, no more complaints, no more attempts at control. She became a ghost of her former self, rarely stepping outside. If she did, it was always with her head down, avoiding eye contact with the very people she had once ruled over. The HOA, finally free from her tyranny, started functioning the way it was supposed to. Meetings were productive instead of hostile. People actually enjoyed living in the neighborhood. No one lived in fear of arbitrary fines or judgmental stares. And Karen? She was nothing more than a cautionary tale. Life in the neighborhood changed almost overnight. Without Karen looming over everyone like an overzealous hall monitor, people finally felt free to enjoy their homes without the constant stress of arbitrary fines and nitpicking. The HOA meetings, once tense battlegrounds, became actual discussions about real community improvements instead of endless debates over mailbox colors and lawn heights. Neighbors started planting flowers in their yards without fear of receiving a passive-aggressive note on their doorstep. The suffocating atmosphere that had lingered for years disappeared, replaced with something the community hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. Karen, on the other hand, had become a shadow of her former self. After her humiliating loss in the HOA election, she completely withdrew from neighborhood affairs. No more bogus complaints. No more self-appointed rule enforcement. No more dramatic outbursts in community meetings. She was still there, of course, her oversized SUV still parked in her driveway, her house still standing on the same street, but it was as if she had faded into the background. If she ever stepped outside, it was only for brief moments, and she avoided eye contact with everyone she had once tormented. The final proof that Karen had truly been defeated came one afternoon as I sat on my porch, enjoying the quiet. Her massive SUV, the same one that had been towed all those months ago, was now parked perfectly within the lines, not a single inch over any boundary. It was almost poetic. After years of disregarding the very rules she had imposed on others, she was finally following them herself. Whether it was out of shame or sheer necessity, one thing was clear: Karen's reign was officially over. Some speculated that she was preparing to sell her house, unwilling to live in a place where she no longer held power. Others thought she was simply too embarrassed to show her face. Either way, it didn't matter. The neighborhood had moved on. Looking back, it was almost astonishing how much influence one person could hold simply through fear and intimidation. But Karen had made the fatal mistake of underestimating the people around her. When enough people had finally decided they'd had enough, her power crumbled in an instant. It makes you wonder, how many neighborhoods out there are dealing with their own version of Karen right now? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.